Out in the backcountry, distance isn't just measured in miles. It's measured in how long it would take for someone to realize something's gone wrong. These accounts come from people who spent time in places where routine is everything, and even small disruptions stand out more than they should. I was in my second season working a remote trail management outpost in the northern section of the Salmon Chalice National Forest. The kind of place where the radio only worked clearly for about an hour in the morning, and again just before dark if the weather held steady. And most days were built around maintenance logs, clearing blowdowns, and updating the permit board at a trailhead that saw maybe 3 hikers a week in late September, which is when this happened. The station itself was a single-room structure with a narrow bunk, a metal desk bolted to the floor, and a small generator shed about 30 yards out, and I had a routine I stuck to without thinking. Coffee first, then a perimeter walk, then logging weather and checking the sign-in box down at the trail junction. And that morning the first thing that stood out wasn't dramatic. It was just that the latch on the sign-in box was already open when I got there, hanging slightly crooked like it hadn't been closed properly, which does happen. But usually the hinge squeaks loud enough that I'd notice it from a distance, and this time it hadn't. So I figured maybe I missed it the night before. But when I flipped through the log pages, there was a new entry written in pencil that didn't match the usual style. No permit number, just a name that looked pressed too hard into the paper, like whoever wrote it wasn't used to filling those out, and the date was written a day ahead, which I assumed was just someone getting it wrong, except the handwriting was neat in a careful way, not rushed or sloppy. And I remember standing there longer than I needed to, looking down the trail where it bent into timber, trying to recall if I'd heard anyone come in late the previous evening, but nothing came to mind beyond the generator hum and wind moving through dry needles. So I closed the box, made a note to log it, and went back up to the station. And for most of the morning, nothing else felt out of place. I checked the radio twice, ran a generator for an hour to top off power, and spent some time repairing a warped section of the porch railing. But around midday I noticed something small again. One of the trail markers I had replaced earlier that week, the reflective strip nailed to a lodge pole about 50 yards downslope, was missing, not broken or fallen, just gone clean. And I remember thinking that was odd, because those markers aren't useful for anything except guiding people, and even then only if they're spaced out properly. So, removing one didn't make sense, unless someone wanted that section to be harder to follow, which I told myself was overthinking it. Maybe someone took it as a souvenir, though that hadn't happened out there before. And I let it go until late afternoon when the light started thinning out faster than I expected because cloud cover rolled in from the west, bringing that flat gray color that makes distance harder to judge. And I decided to walk the first half mile of the trail just to see if anyone had come through. Partly because of the log entry and partly because of that missing marker. And about 10 minutes in, I saw a set of boot prints that didn't match any tread pattern I'd seen recently, deeper on the right foot than the left. Like the person was carrying uneven weight or favoring one side, and they weren't following the center of the trail. They kept drifting slightly off to the edge where the ground was softer, which made tracking easier but also meant whoever it was knew enough to avoid leaving clear impressions on the packed sections. And I followed them a little farther than I should have given the light, until they veered off completely into a patch of dense undergrowth, where there's no reason to go unless you're deliberately stepping off trail. And that's where I stopped, because my radio was already starting to pick up static, and I knew I needed to be back before the evening check-in window. So I marked the spot mentally and headed back, moving faster than I had on the way out. And when the station came into view, I noticed something that didn't sit right at all. The door to the generator shed was slightly ajar, not wide open, just enough to break the straight line of the frame. And I was sure I'd latched it after the morning run. I always did, because the hinge catches wind otherwise and bangs. So I slowed down without really thinking about it, listening for anything out of place. But all I heard was the wind picking up, and the distant rattle of loose branches. And when I got closer, I saw the latch hadn't been forced. It was just unhooked. And inside, everything looked mostly the same. Except the fuel can I kept against the back wall had been moved forward by maybe a foot. Not tipped or opened, just repositioned, like someone had handled it and set it down without much care. And I stood there longer than I want to admit, trying to decide if I had moved it myself and forgotten, which isn't impossible when you're working alone long enough, but it didn't feel like that kind of mistake. And by then the light was fading quicker, that dull gray shifting toward early dark. So I shut the shed, checked the main cabin, locked everything up, and got on the radio for the scheduled call. But the signal was worse than usual, cutting in and out, and I had to repeat my check-in twice before the ranger down at district acknowledged it, and I mentioned the log entry and the missing marker in the shed latch, keeping it casual because none of it sounded serious on its own. And he just told me to note it and keep an eye out. Said it was probably a late-season hunter passing through, which made sense on paper, but the season hadn't officially opened in that section yet, and that stayed in the back of my mind as I settled in for the night. The generator off, just the battery light inside, and wind pressing against the walls. And sometime after midnight, I woke up, not to a sound exactly, but to a change in the way the air felt, like the pressure had shifted, and I lay there listening until I caught it. A faint, irregular tap. Not on the door, but somewhere along the outer wall, spaced out enough that it didn't sound like wind or branches, more like someone testing the siding with something small. And I didn't move right away, just kept still, counting the gaps between each tap, trying to convince myself it was something natural. But then it stopped completely. No transition, just silence. And that was worse, 'cause the wind was still there, steady and low. So the absence of that tapping stood out, and I eventually got up, moved quietly to the window, and used the edge of the curtain to look out without turning on a light. And at first I didn't see anything except the faint outline of trees and the darker shape of the shed. But then I noticed the ground near the trailhead, where the dirt meets the gravel, and there was a shape there that hadn't been earlier.
A darker patch that took a second to resolve into what looked like a backpack, set down upright. No person next to it, just the pack, sitting there, as if someone had paused
Mid-step and walked off without it, and I stayed there watching longer than I should have, expecting someone to step back into view and grab it, but nothing moved. And eventually, the cold started coming through the glass enough that I had to step away. And I didn't go outside, not that night. I just kept the radio close and waited for morning. And when the light finally came up, thin and pale, I went out expecting to find that pack right where I'd seen it. But the ground was empty, except for a set of tracks leading away from where it had been. Not toward the trail, but back into the same off-trail direction I had followed the day before. And later, when I went to log everything properly, I flipped back to that entry in the sign-in box, and I realized something I hadn't caught the first time. The name written there wasn't just pressed hard into the paper. It had been traced over twice, like whoever wrote it wanted to make sure it stayed visible, even after the top sheet was torn out. And when I checked the previous page underneath, the indentation of that same name was there too, even though the page above it had been blank when I last looked. I wasn't a ranger, not officially, just a contracted maintenance tech in my late 30s, handling seasonal repairs for a cluster of fire lookout support cabins in the high desert edge of southeastern Oregon. And that fall, I'd been assigned to a 2-week job replacing solar battery units and checking structural wear on 3 isolated sites that barely saw visitors once summer ended. The kind of assignment where you load everything into a government pickup, sign out a radio that only hits repeaters if you're on the right ridge, and expect to go a couple days at a time without speaking to anyone. The second cabin on my route sat off a narrow service road that cut through open sage and scattered juniper, about 9 miles from the nearest paved access. And by the time I got there, the sky had that washed-out look you get before an early cold front, wind pushing low across the ground instead of through the trees. And the first thing that bothered me wasn't the cabin itself, but the gate about a mile back that I had to unlock, because it was already unlatched when I pulled up, chain looped but not secured. Which doesn't happen often since those gates are more about tracking who's out there than keeping people out. And I remember checking the dust for tire marks and seeing two distinct sets. One older, and one recent enough that the edges hadn't softened yet, both heading in the same direction I was going. So I figured maybe another crew had come through, though I hadn't been told about anyone else working that sector, and I made a note to ask when I got back into range, and drove on, slower than before, watching the mirrors more than the road. And when the cabin finally came into view, it looked normal from a distance. Low structure, metal roof, storage shed off to the side. But the front door was open by a few inches, just enough to show a thin line of darkness inside. And that stopped me in place, because I knew I'd locked it at the end of the previous season myself. New hasp, new padlock. And as I got closer, I saw the lock wasn't broken. It was hanging there, unlocked, key still in it. Which made even less sense because there are only 3 copies of those keys, and mine was in my pocket. So I didn't rush in. I circled once instead, checked the shed, the water tank, the small solar array mounted behind the cabin. And everything looked intact except for one panel that had been tilted slightly upward, like someone had tried to adjust it without knowing the proper angle. And inside the cabin, the air felt stale in a way that suggested it had been opened more than once recently. Not just that morning. There was a faint smell of propane even though the tank valve was closed. And on the small table, where I usually spread out tools, there was a folded topographic map that didn't belong to the station inventory, edges worn soft, with a section circled in blue pen, about 2 miles east, off any maintained trail. And I remember standing there with that map in my hands, trying to figure out why someone would come all the way out here, unlock the place properly, not take anything obvious, and then leave something behind instead. And I probably would have convinced myself it was another contractor, if not for the radio, because when I keyed it up to check signal, I got a response almost immediately, which shouldn't have happened given my position in that basin. And the voice on the other end wasn't one I recognized from the district. It was calm, but slightly off in cadence, like someone repeating a phrase they'd heard before. And all it said was, "Unit 3, confirm you're at the East Cabin." And I didn't answer right away. I just listened, waiting for a call sign, or some identifier that would make it make sense. But nothing came, just a short burst of static and then silence. And when I tried to respond, the signal dropped out completely, which left me standing there, holding the radio in one hand and that map in the other, realizing that whoever had been here might not be far, and more importantly, might know exactly where I was supposed to be. I decided to stick to my work schedule, partly because leaving immediately would mean driving back through that open gate with unknown speed, which is tracks behind me and no comms, and partly because I didn't want to escalate something I didn't understand. So I kept busy, swapped out the battery unit, checked the wiring, logged voltage readings, all while paying closer attention to small things. The way the wind shifted direction briefly and then settled, the absence of any animal movement in the scrub, even the way my truck's metal ticked as it cooled. And sometime in the late afternoon, when the light started flattening and shadows stretched longer across the ground, I noticed a vehicle parked out past the rise to the north, not visible from the cabin, unless you stepped out and looked at the right angle. Just the top half of it catching the light, dark color, older model from the shape. And it hadn't been there earlier, I was sure of that, and there was no movement around it, no door open, no figure nearby. Just sitting there as if it had been placed deliberately out of sight. And that's when I packed up faster than planned, loaded my tools without organizing them the way I usually would, and got back in my truck with the radio on even though it was still mostly static. And as I started the engine, I saw something that made me hesitate just long enough to second-guess leaving. The key that had been in the cabin door lock was no longer there, the padlock hanging closed now, secured from the outside. even though I hadn't touched it since I arrived, and I know how that sounds. But I checked my pockets, checked the ground, even stepped back out to make sure I wasn't misremembering, and the lock was definitely closed. No key, which meant someone had been close enough, quiet enough, and confident enough to walk up to that door while I was inside or around the back and lock it without me noticing. And I didn't waste time after that. I drove straight back toward the gate, keeping my speed steady to avoid kicking up too much dust. And when I reached the spot where I'd seen that other vehicle, it was gone. No sound of it leaving, just an empty patch of ground with faint tire impressions leading off in a direction that didn't connect to any mapped road. And by the time I got to the gate, the chain had been looped properly again, locked this time with a different padlock than the one assigned to that sector. Newer, clean metal that hadn't been weathered yet. And I sat there for a minute with the engine running, looking at it, knowing I didn't have the key for that one, and weighing whether to cut it or try to backtrack through rough terrain to another access point before dark. And while I was deciding, the radio cracked once, just a short burst, and that same voice came through again, quieter this time, closer to the tone people use when they think they're speaking to someone standing right next to them. And it said, "You're ahead of schedule," and then nothing else. And I ended up cutting the lock and getting out before nightfall. But when I filed the report 2 days later, the district office told me there were no other crews assigned to that area, no vehicles logged through that gate. And the cabin inventory sheet listed that topographic map as an item that had been removed from storage almost a year earlier and never checked back in, with a note that it was last issued to someone using my name.